You make a joke about your boss today. Maybe at dinner, maybe in a text message. Nothing happens. You forget about it by morning. Now imagine that same joke costing you your entire family, your name, and every trace of your existence. That is not an exaggeration. That is Tuesday in ancient Rome. You have probably heard that insulting the emperor was dangerous. But the real answer is far stranger than dangerous. It was not really about what you said. It was about what you failed to say, what your face did while someone else was speaking, and whether you laughed at the right moment during dinner. Let's go back. Rome, 1st century. An emperor sits at the center of an empire so large, it takes weeks to cross it by horse. He cannot see most of it. He cannot hear what people whisper in the provinces. So he builds a substitute for his own eyes and ears. It is called Maiestas. Loosely, it means diminishing the majesty of the Roman people. In practice, it means anything that makes the emperor look small. Here is the strange part. Maiestas laws existed long before the emperors. Originally, they punished actual treason, betraying an army, selling out to an enemy, real crimes with real consequences. But under emperors like Tiberius, the law stretched and stretched until it covered almost anything. A senator once melted down a silver coin bearing the emperor's face to make cups. He was charged with Maiestas. A man undressed near a statue of Augustus. Charged. Someone complained about the weather while standing close to an imperial image. Charged. The historian Tacitus, who lived through this exact period, wrote about it with open disbelief. He described watching the law consume people for offenses that barely qualified as offenses at all. Why did this happen? Because fear is a tool, and tools get used more the longer you hold them. Think about your own workplace for a second. Not literally comparable, obviously, but you know the feeling of a room going quiet when the wrong person walks in. You know how a joke changes shape depending on who might overhear it. Now multiply that feeling by an empire and give it the power of execution. The Emperor Tiberius spent his final years on the island of Capri, isolated, paranoid, convinced that Rome was full of people plotting against him. He relied on a network of informers called delatores. These were ordinary citizens who reported suspicious behavior in exchange for a cut of the accused person's property. Suddenly, your neighbor had a financial incentive to remember your bad jokes. Your dinner guests had a financial incentive to repeat what you said after the wine came out. The historian Suetonius recorded case after case of Romans destroyed not by armies or enemies, but by people they had shared a meal with the week before. Here is the twist most people never expect. You did not even need to say anything. Under Domitian, one of the more paranoid emperors, the walls of his palace were lined with polished stone, specifically so he could see behind himself while walking. He was that convinced someone was always about to strike, and under his rule, silence itself became suspicious. If you did not applaud enthusiastically enough at his games, that was noted. If you looked too somber when he expected celebration, that was noted. If you looked too cheerful right after a family member's execution, on the assumption you were secretly relieved, that was noted too. There was no safe expression, no safe silence, no safe joke, because the crime was never really about your words. It was about what your words implied about your loyalty, and loyalty is not something you can prove. You can only fail to disprove disloyalty, which is a much harder trap to escape. Punishment scaled with paranoia. Exile was common, and it was brutal in its own quiet way. You lost your citizenship, your property, your name in official records. Execution was more direct, but Rome had a specialty punishment reserved for people the state wanted to erase completely. It was called Damnatio Memoriae, condemnation of memory. Your statues were torn down. Your name was chiseled off inscriptions, sometimes so aggressively you can still see the scrape marks on stone today. Coins bearing your face were melted. Your children, in some cases, were forbidden from using your name at all. The goal was not just to kill you. The goal was to make it as if you had never existed. Now here is a question worth sitting with for a second. Why erase someone instead of simply killing them? Because Rome understood something that modern psychology would later confirm with actual data. Public memory is a form of power. If people remember you fondly after your death, your ideas survive you. Your allies gain legitimacy. Your enemies, meanwhile, gain nothing from your death if your name still commands respect. So they didn't just end your life, they ended your story. This is where the ancient world starts looking uncomfortably familiar. The psychologist Stanley Milgram ran a series of experiments in the 1960s that still get taught in university classrooms today. He wanted to know how far ordinary people would go if an authority figure told them to keep going, even when it clearly hurt someone else. The result over and over was that most people obeyed, not because they were cruel, because authority creates a kind of gravity. It pulls behavior toward compliance, even against a person's own instincts. Rome had built an entire civilization on that same gravity, just amplified through fear of exile, fear of execution, fear of erasure. Milgram showed that authority alone can bend behavior in a lab, with no real stakes beyond a slightly uncomfortable afternoon. Rome showed what happens when the stakes are your entire bloodline's existence in the historical record. You do not live under an emperor. You are not worried about Damnatio Memoriae, but you have probably felt a smaller, quieter version of this same instinct. A photo you didn't post because someone in your life might see it wrong. An opinion you kept to yourself in a meeting because you weren't sure how it would land. A joke you rehearsed twice in your head before deciding it wasn't worth the risk. Historian Mary Beard, who has spent much of her career studying how Roman power actually functioned day to day, has pointed out that the emperor's authority was never really as absolute as the marble statues suggest. Much of it depended on people believing it was absolute and adjusting their own behavior accordingly. The fear did the enforcing. The emperor barely had to lift a finger. That is the part that should unsettle you a little. The system did not need every informer to be right. It only needed enough uncertainty that everyone assumed someone might be listening. Once that assumption sets in, people start policing themselves. No one has to actually watch you if you're convinced you're being watched. Rome eventually softened some of these laws. Later emperors like Nerva and Trajan publicly renounced the worst abuses of Maiestas trials, partly because the previous decades had shown how corrosive the fear had become, even for the people supposedly protected by it. Informers were distrusted, trials were reformed, but the underlying instinct, the human tendency to self-censor the moment power feels close enough to notice you, never fully disappeared. It just changed shape. So the next time you catch yourself softening a comment, deleting a message before sending it, or laughing a half-second later than you meant to because you clocked who was in the room, you are running a very old piece of software, one that was refined over centuries by people who understood something uncomfortable about human behavior. You do not need real surveillance to control a population. You only need the belief that surveillance might exist. You made a joke about your boss today. Maybe you sent it, maybe you deleted it first. Either way, some ancient part of you already knew exactly why.